The courtroom was quiet, almost too quiet for a place where justice was supposed to be served. People sat rigid in their seats, eyes fixed on the judge, who had just called the next witness to the stand. The air was thick with tension, not because of loud arguments or heated exchanges, but because everyone knew this case was more than just a trial. It was about truth, about fairness, and about a community that had long felt forgotten. Elias Turner, a man in his late 70s, shuffled slowly toward the witness stand. His steps were measured, his face calm but marked by years of endurance. His silver hair caught the light streaming through the tall courtroom windows, and his deep brown eyes scanned the room, as if looking for something, maybe hope. He adjusted the cuffs of his worn jacket, a subtle gesture that belied the weight on his shoulders. Today, he was more than just a witness. He was a symbol. Before Elias could speak, the atmosphere shifted. A police officer, standing nearby as security, suddenly reached for his belt and pulled out his sidearm. Gasps filled the room. The officer's finger hovered near the trigger, his gaze locked onto Elias, with something unreadable, fear, anger, or maybe something deeper. The judge's gavel slammed down, trying to restore order, but the moment had already stretched too far. The crowd leaned forward, breath held, waiting for what seemed inevitable. But then, the courtroom doors creaked open. In stepped a young man, tall and steady, dressed in a sharp suit that spoke of discipline and authority. His eyes never left the officer, who now seemed to hesitate, as if realizing that he was being watched more closely than he knew. That young man was Malcolm Turner, Elias's son, an FBI agent who had been quietly observing, waiting for the moment his father's courage would be tested. Malcolm's presence wasn't just a coincidence, it was a shield, a silent promise that the truth would not be ignored today. As the officer slowly lowered his gun, Elias took a deep breath and began to speak, his voice steady, filled with the quiet strength of a man who had faced many battles but never lost faith. "I have lived through times when justice seemed out of reach," he said. "But today, I stand here not just for myself, but for everyone who believes that fairness must always win." Outside the courtroom, the town held its breath. Inside, the fight for truth had only just begun. The early morning light filtered softly into Elias's modest home, painting gentle streaks across the walls lined with photographs. Each frame told a story, memories of family, milestones, and moments that shaped a life dedicated to justice. Elias rose from his bed, muscles aching with age but heart steady with purpose. Today was important. Today, he was not just testifying, he was carrying the hopes of a community. His late wife's favorite quilt still covered his bed, a reminder of love that had weathered storms and the passing of time. He touched the gold wedding band on his finger, worn smooth from years of holding tight to promises made long ago. Elias moved through the familiar rhythms of his morning, each small task grounding him. The scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the kitchen as he prepared a simple breakfast. His eyes lingered on a photograph of Malcolm's graduation from the FBI Academy, the pride in his smile untouched by time. The newspaper on the porch had already caught his attention. Headlines about Officer Brent Maddox's ongoing trial, the allegations of misconduct, and whispers of long-suppressed truths filled the pages. Elias knew the road ahead would not be easy. Maddox wasn't just a man on trial, he was a symbol of a system many believed was broken. By the time Elias stepped outside, his friend Lewis was waiting in his old Buick, offering a steady presence for the journey to court. The familiar sights of their small town passed by, faces turned to watch them, some with curiosity, others with quiet support. But Elias sensed the undercurrent of fear and anger that still lingered beneath the surface. Lewis's voice was low, but firm as they drove. "They've been trying to silence you, Elias. They don't want this story told." Elias nodded, his gaze fixed ahead. Then it's time they listened. Every step into the courthouse was a step toward hope and healing. Though the walls had witnessed countless battles, today felt different. Today, justice wasn't just a word, it was a promise waiting to be kept. The day wore on slowly, the weight of what was to come settling deeper into Elias's chest like an unshakable shadow. The courthouse was alive with whispered conversations and nervous shuffles, a place where hope and fear intertwined beneath the ornate ceilings. Elias found his seat among the witnesses, hands folded tightly on his lap. His eyes scanned the room, landing briefly on the face of the man at the center of it, Officer Brent Maddox. Maddox sat with an air of false confidence, the type that only grows from years of privilege and the illusion of invincibility. His sharp uniform seemed to demand respect, but his eyes betrayed a restless unease, as if he knew the walls were closing in. Elias felt no anger toward him, only a profound sadness for the officer, for the community, and for the fragile balance between power and responsibility. Suddenly, a voice broke through the murmurs, slicing the tension like a knife. The bailiff announced the arrival of the next witness, Harold Tate. Elias's heart skipped a beat. He knew Harold's story well, a man whose courage had been tested time and again. But it wasn't Harold who commanded the room now. It was the unseen presence in the gallery, a figure cloaked in quiet determination. Malcolm Turner watched from the back, eyes sharp and calculating. His presence was a carefully guarded secret, a shield for his father, and a promise to the truth. He'd been tracking the case quietly for weeks, gathering evidence, waiting for the moment to step forward, not as an officer of the law, but as a son who refused to stand by while injustice threatened to claim another life. The courtroom doors opened suddenly, and Officer Maddox, growing impatient, stood abruptly. His hand hovered near his belt, and the murmurs turned into gasps. As he reached for his sidearm, the room froze. The judge, the jury, the spectators, all caught in a suspended moment where fear could have turned into tragedy. But then Malcolm stepped forward, his calm authority filling the space like a steady heartbeat. "Enough," he said, voice low but firm, every eye snapping to him. The officer's hand faltered, the gun lowering slowly as the reality of being watched settled in. It was a reminder that no one was above the truth, no matter how loudly they believed otherwise. As the courtroom settled once more, Elias took a deep breath and rose to the stand. His voice carried the weight of years spent fighting for justice in silent halls and crowded streets. He spoke not just of Maddox's actions, but of the community's pain, the years of whispered fears and broken promises. Outside the windows, the sun began to dip, casting long shadows that stretched like the memories Elias carried within him. He spoke of hope, of resilience, of a future where courage would outshine fear. Every word was a thread weaving a tapestry of change, drawing listeners into a story that was as much about healing as it was about accountability. Malcolm's presence was more than a secret weapon. It was a beacon for those who had lost faith, proof that the fight for justice was far from over. In the courtroom and beyond, the story of Elias Turner and his son was beginning to ripple outward, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, the light of truth can never be extinguished. The day's testimony closed, but the impact lingered like a quiet storm ready to change everything. Elias and Malcolm shared a glance, an unspoken promise that no matter what came next, they would face it together. Outside, the town waited, breath held, and hearts open, for the next chapter in a story that was still being written. By the following morning, the entire town was humming with quiet tension. In diners and barbershops, on porches and sidewalks, people spoke in careful tones, as if even their words could tip the balance of what was unfolding in that courthouse. But beneath the caution, something else was growing, a current of awareness, of awakening. What had started as a routine misconduct trial had become something far more powerful. At the edge of town, in a small apartment tucked above an old bookstore, Malcolm Turner stood in front of the window, coffee in hand, watching the street below. He had returned to his hometown under the radar, slipping in without ceremony, wearing the quiet confidence of someone who had seen behind too many curtains. To the people outside, he was just another man in a suit. But today, Malcolm wasn't just an observer. He was preparing to step from the shadows. He had spent the night reviewing files, affidavits, transcripts, police reports that had long been ignored or buried. Each page painted a deeper picture of Officer Maddox's unchecked behavior, and worse, the system that had allowed it to thrive. It wasn't just about one man anymore. It was about the silence that had let it all go on. Down at the courthouse, Elias sat quietly on a bench near the window, his briefcase beside him. He looked tired, yes, but there was something steady in his eyes, a calm, a readiness, the kind that comes not from knowing what will happen, but from knowing who you are. As spectators filtered in, so did unfamiliar faces, reporters from out of town, civil rights observers, and quietly a few from neighboring communities who'd heard whispers of what had happened in the courtroom the day before. The story was no longer contained to one town or one trial. It had begun to spread like the first few drops of rain before a storm. Then something unexpected happened. A woman stood up from the gallery and asked the judge if she could speak. The room turned to look. She was soft-spoken, probably in her early 50s, wearing a plain cardigan and carrying a folder in her hands. The judge, surprised but listening, allowed it. Her name was Clarissa Reynolds. She said she wasn't part of the case but had come to observe because she remembered Elias Turner from years ago when she was a teenager and he'd stood up for her father after a wrongful arrest. She'd never forgotten it. Her voice shook slightly as she told the room that Maddox had also targeted her younger brother 2 years ago, but her family had been too afraid to speak, too afraid it would make things worse. Elias turned toward her, and their eyes met. A single nod passed between them, small but full of weight. Clarissa's testimony wasn't official, but it shifted something in the room. One by one, others began whispering similar stories in the hallway. Quiet confessions to reporters, murmurs that Maddox's actions weren't isolated. They were a pattern, a habit, a warning ignored too many times. Malcolm watched it all from the back of the room. This wasn't just about proving guilt anymore. It was about lifting a veil. The prosecution requested a brief recess, and the judge agreed. During the break, Malcolm quietly stepped out and made a call to his FBI contact. "It's time," he said. "I'm bringing this forward. There's more here than anyone's ready to admit." Back inside, Elias had returned to his seat, but his mind was elsewhere, drifting through the years, remembering moments he'd seen justice denied, promises broken. But he also remembered the victories, the days when truth had won, even if only by a sliver. When court resumed, the atmosphere had changed. The judge, once composed and distant, now wore a more reflective expression. The jury leaned forward slightly, listening more closely. Officer Maddox, for the first time, didn't look defiant. He looked unsure. The prosecutor approached Elias for a second round of questions, but this time, the focus shifted. It wasn't just about a single event, it was about a pattern, a culture of quiet tolerance for misconduct, a pattern that Elias had dedicated his life to challenging. As Elias answered, he didn't raise his voice, he didn't point fingers, but his words carried the gravity of truth, and the room, once skeptical, now leaned in to hear every syllable. "We are not here today because one man made a mistake," Elias said. "We're here because too many people saw those mistakes and said nothing. We are here because silence has cost us more than we can count." Outside the courthouse, clouds gathered slowly overhead, not in a way that threatened, but in the way skies do before change arrives. Inside, something was beginning to shift. The jury was no longer simply listening, they were seeing. The judge no longer simply presiding. He was reflecting. And Malcolm, standing in the gallery's shadows, knew the moment was nearing. The moment when silence would end. The moment when truth, no matter how long buried, would finally be heard. Because some stories are too powerful to stay hidden, and this one was only just beginning to rise. The morning of the fourth day broke with an eerie quietness, as if even the birds had paused to listen. A soft fog clung to the courthouse lawn, wrapping the building in a ghostly stillness, as if the town itself was holding its breath. Inside, janitors moved quietly through the marble halls, polishing brass railings and straightening chairs with the reverence of people who sensed they were preparing a stage for something far greater than another court session. And they were right. Back at the modest apartment above the bookstore, Malcolm Turner stood over a long oak table, papers neatly spread before him, but his eyes weren't on the pages. They were fixed on a small leather box sitting at the center. Inside was his badge, not the one he wore on his belt when he was chasing fugitives across state lines. This one was heavier, older, a ceremonial badge passed down through generations, inscribed with his grandfather's initials. It had been given to him by Harold on the day Malcolm graduated from the FBI Academy. He hadn't touched it in years, but today wasn't about protocol or paperwork. It was about legacy, about confronting the shadows that had haunted this town for decades. And for Malcolm, it was personal. Across town, Harold Tate sat in the quiet of the courthouse's witness room, watching the second hand of the wall clock tick forward, its rhythmic click the only sound in the room. He had lived through many days like this, long, uncertain hours before stepping into courtrooms that didn't always welcome his voice. But this time, the weight felt different. This time, his son was here, and not just here in body, but here in purpose. The previous day had ended with the courtroom buzzing. More people had come forward off the record, quietly, but enough to show the tide was shifting. A young woman had slipped a folded note into the defense attorney's inbox. No name, just a date, a location, and a badge number. Malcolm had found her standing near the courthouse steps later that evening, debating whether to disappear again or speak. He'd promised her protection. She had whispered one sentence. Before vanishing into the crowd, he did the same to my brother. No one believed us. Today, that story would be heard. That's the gallery filled. Once again, something new filled the air. No longer the heavy stillness of fear, but the hum of anticipation. There was an energy to the room that hadn't been there before. People from neighboring towns had begun showing up. Journalists, civil rights, attorneys, students, elders. Not all of them knew Harold or even each other, but they came because something powerful was happening here. Something honest. The bailiff called court into session, and Harold took his seat beside his counsel. Maddox's team looked rattled. His lead attorney whispered urgently while flipping through a stack of notes. Maddox himself no longer wore the smug smirk he had carried into the first hearing. Now, his jaw was set tight. His eyes flickered to the gallery again and again, as if expecting someone to leap out with another hidden truth. And in a way, that wasn't far off. The prosecutor stood and announced a surprise witness, a name not on the original list. Malcolm Turner. The gallery murmured, heads turning as the tall, composed man in a dark suit stepped forward, every step deliberate. The judge adjusted his glasses and leaned slightly forward, clearly recognizing the name. Mr. Turner, the prosecutor began, please state your occupation for the court. I am a federal agent with the Bureau of Investigation. I've been in the Bureau for over 15 years. My current assignment is classified, but I requested temporary leave to be here, not as an agent, but as a son. There was a pause, the kind that demands silence not because it's tense, but because something important is unfolding. Malcolm's testimony wasn't dramatic. He didn't shout, he didn't accuse. He laid out facts, patterns, internal memos, reports that had gone unfiled, data showing consistent complaints against Maddox over the past decade, body cam footage that had been reviewed but never submitted as evidence. He presented it all with the calm intensity of a man who had seen how systems could hide behind silence. And then, he spoke of Harold, not as a father, but as a witness, as a man who had spent decades fighting uphill battles without bitterness, as someone who believed in the law, even when the law failed him. He never raised a hand in anger, Malcolm said quietly, but he's raised generations of people in courage. There was no applause, just stillness. The kind that only comes when people are truly listening. When he finished, the judge called for a recess. Outside, the hallway buzzed with whispered astonishment. Ilias walked slowly to the exit, every step measured, as people stepped aside, not out of fear, but out of respect, as Harold sat alone. On a bench in the quiet foyer, a boy no older than 15 approached him. Mr. Tate, he said, nervously clutching his backpack. My grandma said you helped save our neighborhood when they tried to tear it down for that parking lot. She said you stood up when no one else would. Harold smiled gently and nodded. Your grandma's a wise woman. The boy fidgeted for a moment. Can I sit with you? Of course. And there, they sat, an old man and a young boy, two bookends of a community story, both waiting for the next chapter. Inside the courtroom, Officer Maddox sat in silence, feeling the weight of something he had never truly faced before. Not punishment, but accountability. And as the clock ticked on, the town began to understand that what was happening wasn't just a trial, it was a turning point, and no matter how long it had taken, change had finally walked through the courthouse doors quietly, steadily, and with its head held high. The morning of the fifth day arrived, not with a roar, but with a quiet tension that blanketed the town like the stillness before a distant storm. No wind stirred the trees lining Main Street. No birds chirped near the courthouse roof. Even the traffic lights seemed to blink more slowly, as though time itself was pausing to brace for what was coming. But inside the courthouse, inside those tall, weathered walls, something had already begun to shift. And today, that shift would either crack wide open or collapse under its own weight. The gallery was packed again, tighter than ever. Word had spread far beyond the county line. People were showing up from neighboring cities. News vans lined the curb. Students held handmade signs. Pastors from local churches filed quietly into the back rows. It was no longer about one man. It was about all of them. At exactly 9 a.m., Harold Tate entered the courtroom. He moved slowly, but with dignity. A few people stood as he walked down the aisle, just a few, but it was enough. That silent gesture rippled through the room like a tremor. Not demanded, not expected, but earned. Malcolm was already seated behind the prosecution's table, not in uniform, not there to take over, just there to witness. His role had changed. Today, it was Harold's voice that mattered. The judge adjusted his glasses and called the court to order. "Mr. Tate," the prosecutor said, "you may continue your testimony." Harold stood. No cane, no trembling hands, just calm strength, the kind that had been tested by time, grief, and the long weight of truth. He stepped up to the witness stand and looked not at Maddox, but at the jury. "You've heard the facts," he began. "You've seen the reports. But today, I want to talk to you about something more powerful than evidence." The room hushed. Cameras clicked quietly, but even the reporters leaned forward. "I want to talk about memory," Harold continued, "because memory carries truth in a way paper never can." He told them about the first time he ever stood in court, decades ago, defending a friend arrested without cause. He told them about the nights he walked young men home so they wouldn't face the same harassment he once did. He spoke of his wife Martha, of the neighbors who'd left town when the pressure became too heavy, of the children who grew up believing they had to lower their eyes to stay safe. "I am here today," Harold said, "because I refuse to let fear become tradition." He didn't cry, he didn't rage, but the emotion in his voice was undeniable, and that, more than any photograph or document, moved something in the room. The defense attorney rose, trying to discredit him, but his questions landed flat. Harold answered with poise, unwavering in the face of subtle baiting. Each attempt to twist his words only served to highlight the dignity with which he carried his truth. Then something remarkable happened. As the defense tried to shift blame, to suggest the town had always been fair, a murmur started in the gallery. The judge warned for silence, but it was too late. An elderly woman stood. "I'm sorry, Your Honor," she said, "but I can't sit here and listen to this anymore." Gasps echoed. The judge asked her to sit, but before she could, another man rose beside her, then a woman in the back, then two more. One by one, members of the community, black, white, young, old, began to stand, silently. Each one had a story. Each one had been silent too long. One man stepped forward holding an envelope. "This is my brother's complaint from 1998, he said. "Filed, ignored, buried. I kept a copy. I never thought I'd get to give it to someone who could do something about it." The judge ordered a brief recess. Court officers moved to maintain order, but no one was unruly. There was no shouting, just presence, honest, human presence. Outside the courtroom, Harold leaned against a pillar while Malcolm stood beside him. Neither spoke for a moment. Then Malcolm quietly said, "I've worked 100 cases, and I've never seen anything like this." Harold didn't respond right away. He was watching the people, watching as they talked, shared, exchanged glances that held years of unspoken pain. Finally, he turned to his son. "Justice isn't always the verdict," Harold said softly. "Sometimes it's the voice you get back after being silent for too long." As the courtroom prepared to resume, the prosecution approached Malcolm with a quiet proposal. Based on the new evidence and witness testimonies, they would request the trial be expanded into a federal civil rights investigation. Malcolm nodded. The story had outgrown the courthouse. Now it would echo far beyond it. Back inside, Officer Maddox no longer looked angry. He looked tired, as if for the first time he felt the weight of the truth he'd spent years hiding from. The judge called the court to session and announced the final round of testimony would begin tomorrow, along with the possibility of federal charges based on new information presented. The courtroom buzzed, not with noise, but with the powerful stillness that follows a turning tide. As Harold exited the room, he was met by a young mother with a toddler in her arms. "He'll grow up knowing your name," she said, "because today you made us all a little less afraid." Harold simply placed his hand gently on the boy's shoulder and whispered, "Make sure he uses his voice." Outside, the sun had finally broken through the morning clouds, and though the final chapter was yet to be written, the people who gathered that day knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just a court case anymore. It was a movement, a reckoning, a long overdue exhale, and it had been led by the quiet courage of a man who refused to let injustice have the final word. There was a strange calm on the morning of the final hearing, almost sacred stillness, as if the town itself was holding its breath. Clouds stretched thin across a pale sky, casting soft light over the courthouse steps where reporters, townspeople, and even distant travelers had begun to gather. The air was heavy not with fear, but with expectation. Something had shifted. The people felt it. They didn't know what would happen inside those four walls, but they understood something bigger than a verdict was taking shape. Inside the courthouse, the room was already full before the judge even arrived. Rows of benches once divided by suspicion now held neighbors sitting shoulder to shoulder. There were fewer whispers today, fewer averted gazes. Eyes met, heads nodded. People who had once been strangers in their own town now found quiet solidarity in a shared moment of reckoning. Harold Tate sat in the same seat he had all week, calm as ever, dressed in his trusted grey suit. Malcolm sat behind him, not in a suit, not in uniform, just as a son watching his father. They hadn't spoken much the night before. They hadn't needed to. The silence between them had been filled with understanding. The judge entered and called the court to order. This court acknowledges the presence of additional evidence submitted yesterday. The judge began, his tone careful but firm. In light of this, we will now hear closing remarks before a final statement from the court. The prosecutor spoke first, confident but measured. He reviewed the evidence, a pattern of complaints, a trail of intimidation, new testimonies from townsfolk who had once been too afraid to speak. He didn't need to be dramatic. The truth had already revealed itself. Then the defense rose. There was no fire in his voice, no loud objection. It was a quiet surrender disguised as professionalism. He acknowledged the weight of the testimony, framed his client's actions as misguided under pressure, and urged the court to consider the officer's years of service. But even as he spoke, it was clear the wind had shifted. Then, unexpectedly, the judge looked to Harold, "Mr. Tate," he said, "you've been the heart of this case. Before we conclude, would you like to offer a final statement?" There was a pause, just a heartbeat, but in that breath, the room leaned in. Harold stood, not because he had to, because it mattered. He stepped forward, turning not to the judge, not to the lawyers, but to the people. "There's a kind of silence that poisons a place," he said. "Not the peaceful kind, not the respectful kind. I'm talking about the silence that creeps in when people give up, when they stop believing their voice matters." He looked around the room, making eye contact with as many people as he could. "I lived through that kind of silence. I've seen good men broken by it. I've watched women shrink under it. I've watched children grow up thinking it was normal. But something happened in this courtroom," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "We didn't just bring evidence, we brought each other. We remembered that courage is contagious and truth has a voice of its own." He paused, looking toward the back of the room where a young man stood holding the same envelope from the day before. "I didn't come here to win, I came here to witness." A hush fell again. It wasn't the silence of fear this time, it was reverence. The judge nodded, in a rare break from protocol. He offered his own reflection. "What has transpired here may shape the direction of this town for generations," he said. "This court acknowledges the overwhelming evidence, the community testimony, and the significance of what has occurred inside and outside these walls." With that, the judge ruled that Officer Maddox would face immediate removal from duty, with formal charges referred to federal prosecutors. The courtroom did not erupt in applause. No one cheered, but people stood again in quiet dignity. This time, together. Malcolm reached out and gripped his father's shoulder. "You didn't just change the case, Dad," he said quietly. "You changed the town." Harold nodded slowly, eyes misting just a little. "It was never about me," he replied. "It was about waking people up." Outside, the sun had finally broken free of the clouds completely. The courthouse steps were flooded with light, and the crowd that had gathered waited not for drama, but for a glimpse of hope. Walking out the front doors, when Harold emerged, surrounded by those who had once stood in fear but now stood in unity, he didn't make a speech. He simply raised his hand and gave a small, respectful wave. The crowd began to move, not to leave, but to talk, to connect, to share stories. A young woman approached Malcolm to ask about joining the FBI. An elderly man offered Harold a notebook, filled with poems he'd never dared to publish. A boy hugged his father and whispered, "I want to be brave like him." Later that evening, Malcolm and Harold sat on the porch as the sun dipped below the trees. "You think it'll last?" Malcolm asked. "I think it's a beginning," Harold said. And beginnings, son, are the most powerful things of all. And as the stars began to appear, the quiet of the town was no longer the kind that held people back. It was the kind that made space for truth, for healing, for change, because sometimes it only takes one voice to remind everyone else they still have their own.